in college. I did my first big research paper on this, but it's been 20 plus years at this point since I actually read it, and a lot has changed since then. So I wanted to revisit it. One of the things that struck me about it was during the text, Hobbes just out of nowhere mentions that Christ obviously with his resurrection ended the old gods. He sealed them away. They no longer can speak to us or influence us anymore. And I found that interesting because he dropped it very casually, as if this is just a fact that, of course, everybody knows. So let's start from the historical to set the frame. Alex, can you give us a little bit of an idea of where this comes from? Who is talking about this event of the old gods being sealed away, no longer being able to contact them? Where is this recorded in history?
Well, one of the most famous instances of this is the Emperor Julian that we discussed on an earlier episode. And he, so the story goes, was interested in reviving the Oracle of Delphi because it had fallen on bad times. He was, the famous apostate emperor a generation or so after Constantine in 361. And he wanted to revive the old gods. And so he's rebuilding temples all around the empire. And he sends a friend of his, Oribasius, this doctor, vizier sort of figure, to go, inquire, how can we rebuild the temple? And he gets this oracle back that says, go and tell the emperor, the ornate hall has fallen. No longer does Phoebus Apollo have his chamber, nor prophetic laurel, nor prophetic spring, and the speaking water has been silenced. And this is an interesting event. There's some interesting multiple interpretations of this, but essentially it's seen as kind of the last oracle of Delphi being offered. And yet this was the end of a long process that you can see in earlier sources. One of the earliest sources that we have for an actual decline in oracles and in prophecies is Plutarch, who was a 1st century AD philosopher, biographer, very dear to my heart, who wrote a treatise on the decline of oracles. He wrote several treatises on the shrine of Apollo at Delphi. He was, from the neighborhood. He ended up later in life becoming a priest there. So he's, very knowledgeable about the goings on at the Oracle of Delphi. And he, asked this question: why is it that, well, for one thing, the oracle seems to be not speaking in the way that it used to speak. So if you read Herodotus or a lot of the earlier ancient historians, the typical process was when you consult the oracle at Delphi, which is in central Greece, about this or that issue, you get in response usually a verse of hexameters, which is the epic meter that used by Homer and Hesiod, and it's a very ancient dialect. And what probably happened is, you as a petitioner, you go and consult the Pythia, the prophetess, and maybe they let you watch as she sits on this tripod and kind of mutters something interesting but incoherent in this trance-like state, possibly brought on by ethylene gas emitting from the cracks. There's interesting theories about this. And then the priests are there and they kind of, listen and go consult among themselves. And I'm sure that rituals are offered, but they come back to the petitioner with this hexameter. They kind of process it into something slightly more rational, but usually also ambiguous, that is supposed to guide your action. And Plutarch says, well, now the prophet or the oracle doesn't speak in hexameters anymore. It's just, normal language. What happened? And he says, well, kind of tying in with this broader theme that you see in Plutarch of the decline of the Oracle of Delphi and of other oracles, the prophet or the oracle doesn't have the same kind of needs that he's serving today, because in the archaic and classical periods, the Oracle of Delphi was this very important, not just a religious shrine, but a political shrine. City-states would come, they would send ambassadors, should we go to war? Should we try to topple this tyrant? Should I slaughter all of my enemies, etc.? And then the oracle would give something, action guiding. And part of the way that this worked, if you're, a cynical rationalist, is the Oracle of Delphi, the priests there get embassies from all over the Greek world. They have the pulse on everything that's going on, the broader political spectrum, and they're kind of able to actually offer some real concrete third-party neutral advice. But in Plutarch's day, the Oracle is, in the Roman Empire. The Greeks are, they have some modest liberty and within their city-states, but they're basically subjects of Rome. And, you have the Pax Romana, it's peaceful, great, we can build wealth and stuff, but there's not the same kind of political stakes operative in the Greek world. And so the Oracle doesn't have the same kind of charge over human affairs. And so now mostly people are going there and asking, should I get married to XYZ? Should I travel? Should I lend money to this guy? And it's all kind of tedious. And Plutarch says, well, that's why, in point of fact, there are fewer priestesses operative. They went from 3 in the glory days down to 1. And they managed to get all the work done. It used to take 3 priestesses to see all the petitioners, and now it's only 1. So it's not that the Oracle was totally silent at that point, but it clearly declined in political significance. And so Plutarch is an important source. But beginning with the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and especially the 4th century, you start to have debates among Christians and pagans. As Christians are becoming more prominent, some of the pagan intellectuals are saying this stuff is nonsense and we gotta do something. And one of the sources of evidence that they use actually is the veracity of oracles that prove that the pagan gods are still operative in the world. And a lot of the Christian church fathers push back and they cite other pagan sources that talk about how the oracles are declining. And there are various prophecies that they cite where somebody will petition, say, the Oracle at Delphi or Claros or Didyma. I mean, there's many of these. And some of them have already been shut down by this point, like the famous Oracle at Dodona in central Greece. It's just not operative anymore. And they're, a lot of people are getting back oracles saying, sorry, the god doesn't have anything to say. Maybe you should just offer a sacrifice in kind of pious contrition and hope that things will change someday. I mean, you get the sense that these priests are sort of starting to see a decline in their finances because people are consulting the oracles less. One of the explanations that some scholars have offered that's very interesting on this is you get the rise, just kind of organically within paganism in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, of astrology and various forms of magic, divination, becoming a medium. You can, if you perform certain rituals, a philosopher will be able to offer you some kind of rubric where you can just sit in your triclinium and consult the gods on your own, kind of become your own oracle. And clearly this would take from the market share of an important oracle like Delphi, especially if it's just what god should I sacrifice to make the crops grow this year, and kind of petty, as it were, personal private matters. And so the Christian apologists are able to draw on this tradition. They also are reading Plutarch. Eusebius quotes from Plutarch's Decline of Oracles treatise extensively. And one of Plutarch's theories that Eusebius quotes is the idea that maybe, Plutarch himself says this, maybe the god Apollo kind of can't be bothered with these, petty private affairs, and he sends subordinates, subaltern, emissary in the form of daimones, lesser spirits, the daimons, as the actual producers of these prophecies. Like it's like a lesser divinity, because Plutarch is already in this sort of early Neoplatonic world of seeing the gods as sort of above material concerns, which is a new thing compared with the classical period. And so Eusebius takes this and says, well, actually, the oracles are, just like Plutarch says, demons, because daimon has this very different resonance in the context of the Christian tradition, and the starting with the Septuagint, the demons are bad, right? For the pagans, the daimon is just like a hero maybe, or a demigod, a lesser divinity. So that's one way to take it. Or you can take it the way that Athanasius takes it, and on the incarnation, he talks about, let me see if I can pull up the quote here. He says, whereas formerly every place was full of deceit of the oracles, and the oracles of Delphi and Dodona, and in Boeotia and Lycia and Libya and Egypt, et cetera, that they were held in high repute in men's imagination. Now, since Christ has begun to be preached everywhere, their madness has also ceased, and there is none among them to divine anymore. So I think he's, on the one hand, these archaeology does tell us that these centers are still, somewhat operative, at least as economic and political centers. I mean, there's still like, settlements and cities around these temples, but there's also a lot of evidence that people are not consulting them anymore. And sometimes they're consulting them and not getting any answers. And so the Christians really pounce on this until at the very latest you get, the last oracle at Delphi, or, Theodosius in 391, the emperor, the great Orthodox Emperor Theodosius, puts a stop to all pagan ritual and sacrifices, and so he sort of outlaws the going to of temples for the sake of consulting the divinities. So it is a very real, well documented phenomenon, and there's a lot of one could say more about kind of internal pagan skepticism of oracles and jugglery, as Hobbes talks about. And Hobbes is very funny when he talks about the way that pagans divinize things like snakes and onions and such. But he's actually drawing on this tradition kind of within paganism of saying, these guys are mostly just charlatans, aren't they? So kind of a complicated story.